Welcome to Cafe Tales, where every story is a new mystery waiting to be solved. Grab a coffee, stay curious, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started. Miss Marple and the Knitting Circle Mystery Chapter 1, A Stitch Out. Of Placide autumn of 1930 descended upon St Mary Mead with unusual severity. Rain lashed against the window panes of the village cottages with such persistence that even the most stalwart gardeners had retreated indoors, abandoning their chrysanthemums to the mercy of the elements, the wind, carrying with it the first bitter chill of the approaching winter, whistled through the ancient yew trees surrounding the parish church, creating an eerie melody that seemed to herald something sinister. It was on just such an afternoon that Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy sitting room, her nimble fingers working methodically at a particularly intricate pattern of pale blue wool. The fire crackled pleasantly in the great cast-iron grate, dancing shadows across the antimacassars and figurines that adorned the room. A delicate porcelain teacup sat at her elbow, the Earl Grey within having gone quite cold, forgotten in her concentration. Miss Marple was not alone. Across from her, ensconced in the wing-back chair that had belonged to the late Mr. Marple's father, sat her dear friend Dolly Bant. While Mrs. Bantry was struggling visibly with her own knitting, her brow furrowed in concentration as she attempted to master a complicated cable stitch. "I declare, Jane, I shall never achieve your level of proficiency," Mrs. Bantry sighed, holding up what was meant to be the beginnings of a gentleman's scarf, but resembled nothing so much as a misshapen dishcloth. "How you manage such even tension is quite beyond me." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and keen despite her advancing years, twinkled with amusement. "It is merely a matter of practice, Dolly, and perhaps a little patience. You mustn't pull so tightly on the working yarn, you see." Their comfortable exchange was interrupted by a sharp, insistent rapping at the front door. Miss Marple's elderly maid, Florence, could be heard shuffling through the hallway, muttering under her breath at the inconvenience of visitors in such inclement weather. Moments later, Florence appeared at the sitting-room door, her face pinched with disapproval. "And Mrs. Weatherby to see you, madam. She appears to be in quite a state." Before Miss Marple could respond, the visitor in question pushed past Florence and burst into the room. Eleanor Weatherby was indeed in a state of considerable agitation. Her normally immaculate coiffure was dishevelled, tendrils of dark hair escaping from beneath her hat. Her mackintosh dripped steadily onto the carpet, creating a small puddle at her feet. Most alarming of all was the expression of naked fear upon her countenance. "Miss Marple," she gasped, seemingly oblivious to Mrs. Bantry's presence, "you must help me. Something terrible has happened at the Knitting Circle." Miss Marple set aside her work with deliberate care. "Do sit down, Mrs. Weatherby. Florence will take your coat, and I shall pour you a fresh cup of tea. Whatever has occurred will be better discussed when you have had a moment to compose yourself." Mrs. Weatherby collapsed into the offered chair, her hands trembling as she accepted the steaming cup. After several sips, a touch of colour returned to her pallid cheeks. "Now," said Miss Marple gently, "pray tell us what has distressed you so." "It's Mrs. Simmons," Mrs. Weatherby replied, her voice steadier but still tinged with horror. "She's dead." Mrs. Bantry gave a small exclamation of shock. "Augusta Simmons? But I saw her only yesterday at the post office." "She appeared in perfect health." "Nevertheless," insisted Mrs. Weatherby, "she is most definitely deceased and in the most peculiar circumstances." Miss Marple's expression remained composed, though her eyes sharpened with interest. "Perhaps you might relate the events as they occurred." Mrs. Weatherby drew a deep breath. "As you know, our knitting circle meets every Thursday afternoon at the parish hall. We were all assembled as usual, myself, Mrs. Simmons, Lady Hartley Groves, Miss Peterson, Mrs. Crawford, and our newest member, Mr. Malcolm. Mr. Malcolm, interrupted Mrs. Bantry, clearly intrigued by the presence of a gentleman in what had traditionally been a female gathering. Yes, Reginald Malcolm. He took up residence in Rose Cottage last month, a bachelor of independent means, I understand. Quite accomplished with the needles. He's creating the most exquisite fair owl waistcoat. Mrs. Weatherby waved away this digression, but that is hardly relevant to the tragedy at hand. Pray continue, urged Miss Marple. We had been working for perhaps an hour. Mrs. Simmons was seated by the window, working on a layette for her newest grandchild. She had just remarked upon the worsening of the weather when she suddenly gave a most dreadful gasp. Her knitting fell from her hands, and before any of us could reach her, she had slumped in her chair. Dr. Haddock was summoned immediately, of course, but he pronounced that she had passed away even before his arrival. How very distressing for you all, murmured Miss Marple sympathetically. Did Dr. Haddock offer any explanation for Mrs. Simmons' sudden demise? Mrs. Weatherby glanced nervously over her shoulder, as though afraid of being overheard. He suggested a heart attack, but I'm not convinced. You see, just before she collapsed, Mrs. Simmons had taken a sip from her tea, and afterwards I noticed the strangest odour emanating from her cup almonds. Miss Marple, a distinct scent of bitter almonds. The significance of this detail was not lost on Miss Marple, whose eyebrows rose fractionally. Indeed, did you share this observation with Dr. Haddock? I attempted to do so, but he dismissed my concerns rather briskly, said I was being fanciful in the face of a perfectly natural, if unfortunate, occurrence. Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. But there's more. As we were all milling about in confusion, I happened to glance at Mrs. Simmons' knitting basket. Nestled among her yarns was a small glass vial. I'm certain it wasn't there earlier in the afternoon. Double quotes Mrs. Bantry gasped audibly. Are you suggesting that Augusta Simmons was poisoned in the midst of your knitting circle? That is precisely what I fear, affirmed Mrs. Weatherby grimly, and if I am correct, then one of our members is responsible. But who and why? Augusta was the most inoffensive of women. Miss Marple frowned thoughtfully. Did you secure this vial as evidence, Mrs. Weatherby? A look of shattering crossed the visitor's face. That's just it. When the constable finally arrived, the vial had vanished. No one would believe me when I insisted upon its existence. They all regard me as a hysterical woman with an overactive imagination. Eyes, brimming with tears, fixed pleadingly on Miss Marple. But you believe me, don't you? You'll help discover the truth. There was a moment of silence as Miss Marple considered the imploring face before her. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault, and the wind moaned mournfully around the eaves of the cottage. I shall make some inquiries, Miss Marple said at last, her tone measured, though I make no promises as to the outcome. Murder is a serious accusation, Mrs. Weatherby, but not an unprecedented one in our village, Mrs. Bantry observed dryly, despite its bucolic appearance. Miss Marple acknowledged this with a slight inclination of her head. Indeed, St Mary Mead has witnessed its share of human wickedness. Now, Mrs. Weatherby, I should like to know more about the members of your knitting circle. You mentioned Lady Hartley Groves, Miss Peterson, Mrs. Crawford, and Mr. Malcolm. Might you elaborate on each? For the next half hour, Eleanor Weatherby provided detailed descriptions of her fellow knitters, Lady Hartley, Groves imperious and wealthy, whose late husband had been a colonial administrator in India, Miss Amelia Peterson, a spinster of uncertain age who served as companion to the elderly Lord Danby at the manor house, Mrs. Crawford, the vicar's wife, known for her charitable works and somewhat lax standards of housekeeping. And finally, Reginald Malcolm the newcomer, about whom little was known except that he had spent considerable time abroad, and possessed an extensive knowledge of exotic poisons, garnered during his travels in South America. This Mr. Malcolm intrigues me, Miss Marple commented when Mrs. Weatherby had finished. A gentleman who knits is something of a rarity, is he not? He claims to have taken it up during a prolonged convalescence following some tropical ailment. Explained. Mrs. Weatherby says he finds it soothing to the nerves. He's quite charming in his way, though there's something about his eyes a coldness, perhaps. Lady Hartley Groves is quite taken with him, however invites him to tea at the Hall regularly. And what of Mrs. Simmons? Did she share Lady Hartley Groves' favourable opinion of Mr. Malcolm? Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. Not entirely, in fact. Last week, after our meeting, Augusta mentioned that Mr. Malcolm reminded her of someone from her past, someone she had encountered during her youth, when her father managed a bank in London. She seemed troubled by the recollection, though she wouldn't elaborate when I pressed her. Very interesting, murmured Miss Marple, her fingers resuming their work upon the blue wool. And did Mr. Malcolm overhear this observation? I couldn't say for certain. He was across the room, engaged in conversation with Miss Peterson, but he does have remarkably acute hearing. On several occasions, he has commented on remarks made quite some distance from him. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. One final question, if you please. The tea that Mrs. Simmons drank. Who prepared it? Well, we all bring our own refreshments. The Hall has no facilities for preparation, so Mrs. Simmons brought her own. Tea in a thermos flask. No, corrected Miss Marple. She always brought a bottle of homemade elderflower cordial. Tea interfered with her sleep if taken after 3 o'clock. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. Yet you mentioned that before her collapse, she had taken a sip from her tea. Mrs. Weatherby blinked in confusion. Did I? How peculiar. You're quite right, of course. It was a cordial she was drinking. I can't imagine why I said tea. A natural slip in your distressed state. Miss Marple reassured her kindly. Now, I believe the most useful course of action would be for me to attend your next knitting circle. Meeting? When is it scheduled? Next Thursday, as usual. But surely you don't mean to wait a whole week before investigating? The murderer might escape. I doubt that very much, said Miss Marple calmly. If murder has indeed been committed, and we mustn't leap to conclusions. Mrs. Weatherby, then the perpetrator will have established a presence in the community. A hasty departure would only confirm suspicion. Besides, I have always found that patience is essential in untangling complicated patterns, whether in wool or in human behaviour. After Mrs. Weatherby had departed, somewhat reassured by Miss Marple's promise of assistance, Mrs. Bantry fixed her friend with a knowing look. You're intrigued, Jane. I can tell by the way your eyes are gleaming. Do you believe Augusta Simmons was murdered? Miss Marple sighed. I believe Mrs. Weatherby detected the scent of bitter almonds, which suggests the presence of cyanide. Whether it was administered deliberately or accidentally remains to be determined. But there is one curious aspect to this affair that gives me pause. And what is that? The vial in the knitting basket. If Mrs. Weatherby's account is accurate, it suggests that someone wished to implicate Mrs. Simmons in her own death to suggest suicide. Perhaps. But then why remove the evidence? It is a contradiction that requires explanation. Mrs. Bantry nodded sagely. A mystery indeed. Well, you shall have to apply your particular genius to the matter, Jane. Though I must say, poison at the knitting circle, whatever next. Human nature remains constant, Dolly, regardless of the setting. Miss Marple replied, her expression grave. Where there are people, there are passions, greed, fear, jealousy, revenge, and where those exist, murder may follow as surely as night follows day, as if in emphasis of her words. A deafening crack of thunder shook the cottage, and the rain redoubled its fury against the windows. In the sudden brightness of a lightning flash, Miss Marple's countenance was illuminated, revealing a determination that belied her fragile appearance. The game was afoot, and Jane Marple had no intention of allowing a killer to escape justice not in her beloved village of St Mary Mead. Chapter 2. The pattern unfolds. Following morning dawned with an unexpected clarity. After the previous day's tempest, a pale sun illuminated the raindrops that clung like diamonds to the branches of Miss Marple's prized hydrangeas, and birdsong had replaced the howling of the wind. The transformation seemed almost deliberately orchestrated, as though nature herself wished to provide a counterpoint to the dark business that now occupied the elderly spinster's thoughts. Miss Marple rose at her customary hour, performed her morning ablutions with characteristic precision, and dressed in a tweed costume of muted grey that had seen better days but remained eminently serviceable. After a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, she donned her hat and gloves, took up her umbrella — the ground would still be quite sodden despite the sunshine — and set forth upon her mission. Her first destination was the vicarage, a modest Georgian edifice, set back from the main lane behind an untidy garden that reflected the somewhat haphazard nature of its mistress. Mrs. Crawford answered the door herself, her apron dusted with flour and a streak of what appeared to be jam adorning one cheek. Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise! Do come in. I'm afraid the drawing-room is in rather a state. Leonard's parish committee met here last evening, and I haven't yet tiddied away the cups, but the kitchen is warm, if you don't mind sitting there. Not at all, Mrs. Crawford, replied Miss Marple equably. Indeed, I've always found that the most illuminating conversations take place in kitchens rather than drawing-rooms, the heart of the home, as they say. The vicarage kitchen was indeed warm and redolent with the scent of baking. A large mixing bowl occupied the central table, and various ingredients were scattered across the workspace in a manner that would have induced palpitations in Miss Marple's methodical housekeeper. Preparing for the church fete, I see, observed Miss Marple, noting the quantity of flour and fruit. Mrs. Crawford nodded, gesturing for her visitor to take a seat at the small breakfast nook by the window. 24 Victoria sponges required, and I've barely begun. But I mustn't complain, the proceeds go to the orphanage fund after all. Now, what brings you out so early? Not that it isn't lovely to see you, of course. Miss Marple came directly to the point. I understand there was a most distressing incident at the knitting circle yesterday afternoon. The vicar's wife's naturally flushed complexion deepened in colour. Oh, you've heard about poor Augusta, then? Dreadful business. Quite dreadful. One moment she was commenting on the ferocity of the storm, the next Mrs. Crawford made an expressive gesture with flour-covered hands. Dr. Haddock says it was her heart. A mercy, really, that it was so quick. No suffering. You were present when it happened, I believe? Indeed I was, sitting right across from her, working on a pair of mittens for young Jimmy Collins. His mother can't afford to replace the ones he lost, poor child. And did you observe anything unusual prior to Mrs. Simmons' collapse? Mrs. Crawford paused in her kneading of dough, a slight frown creasing her brow. Unusual in what way? Any unexpected visitors to the circle, perhaps? Or someone paying particular attention to Mrs. Simmons' refreshments? The frown deepened. Miss Marple, whatever are you suggesting? Augusta died of natural causes. Mrs. Weatherby seems to believe otherwise, remarked Miss Marple mildly. She mentioned detecting a scent of bitter almonds. Mrs. Crawford emitted a most unladylike snort. Eleanor Weatherby would detect intrigue in a Sunday sermon. Always. Has her nose buried in those lurid detective novels. It's addled her brain, if you ask me. Next, she'll be claiming the Ripper is stalking St Mary Mead. Then you noticed no such odour yourself? Certainly not. Though I will say, my sense of smell isn't what it once was, consequence of a bad bout of influenza 3 winters ago. Miss Marple nodded understandingly. And the vial that Mrs. Weatherby claims to have seen in Mrs. Simmons' knitting basket? Pure invention, declared Mrs. Crawford firmly. I helped the constable examine all of Augusta's belongings. Before they were returned to her daughter, there was no vial glass or otherwise. I see. Perhaps we might set aside the question of foul play for the moment. I should be interested to hear your impressions of the other members of the circle. Lady Hartley Groves, for instance. Mrs. Crawford's expression suggested she had just bitten into something sour. Puts on airs, that one. Always reminding US of her late husband's position in Kolkata as if being married to a colonial administrator. Makes her practically royalty. Mind you, the old Hartley Groves fortune isn't what it was. The hall is positively crumbling, and she can't afford to maintain it properly. Too proud to sell, though. And Miss Peterson, the companion to Lord Danby, a mouse of a woman, barely speaks unless spoken, too, though she's surprisingly opinionated when it comes to knitting techniques, quite insistent that her method of turning a heel is superior to all others. Mrs. Weatherby herself, nervous disposition, jumps at shadows. Husband left her comfortably off when he died last year, but she seems incapable of making a decision without consulting half the village first. Not a bad sort, though generous to a fault. And what of Mr. Malcolm? It seems unusual for a gentleman to join a ladies' knitting circle. At the mention of the newcomer, Mrs. Crawford's expression softened noticeably. Oh, Mr. Malcolm is a delight, such exquisite manners and his knowledge of the world. He was telling us just last week about the tribal weaving techniques. He observed in Peru fascinating stuff. Of course, Lady Hartley Groves is throwing herself at him, quite shamelessly, but he bears it with admirable patience. Was he well acquainted with Mrs. Simmons? No more than with the rest of us, I should say, though. Mrs. Crawford hesitated, her hands stilling in their work. Yes, prompted Miss Marple gently. Well, it's probably nothing, but at last week's meeting, Augusta did react rather oddly when Mr. Malcolm mentioned his childhood in London. She became quite pale and excused herself rather abruptly. When she returned, she seemed composed enough, but she hardly spoke for the remainder of the afternoon. Miss Marple absorbed this information with an air of detached interest. Did Mr. Malcolm appear to notice her reaction? If he did, he gave no sign of it. Continued his anecdote about Kensington Gardens without missing a beat. One final question. If I may, was Mrs. Simmons in the habit of bringing elderflower cordial to the meetings? Every week, without fail. Made it herself from the blossoms in her garden. Quite delicious, though a trifle too sweet for my taste. And yesterday's meeting was no exception. No. She had her usual bottle offered me a sip at one point, but I declined, trying to reduce my sugar consumption, you see, doctor's orders. Miss Marple rose to her feet with the careful deliberation that her joints now required. You've been most helpful, Mrs. Crawford. I shan't keep you from your baking any longer. But you haven't explained why you're asking all these questions, protested the vicar's wife. Surely you don't credit Eleanor's absurd suspicions. I merely seek to put a friend's mind at ease, replied Miss Marple placidly. Good day to you, Mrs. Crawford. Her next call was at Daisy Cottage, a charming thatched dwelling on the outskirts of the village where Augusta Simmons' only daughter, Helen, resided. The young woman who answered the door was visibly distressed, her eyes rimmed from weeping, her dark hair hastily pinned up in a manner that suggested she had scarcely given thought to her appearance. Miss Marple, she greeted the visitor with evident surprise. "How kind of you to call. Please come in. I'm afraid the house is rather disordered. Events have been so unexpected." The drawing room into which Helen Simmons ushered her caller displayed signs of recently interrupted activity. An open ledger lay upon a small escritoire, alongside a scatter of correspondence. A half-empty cup of tea sat on a side table, a lipstick mark adorning its rim. "I was attempting to compose the funeral announcements," explained Helen, noticing Miss Marple's glance toward the desk. "One never anticipates having to make such arrangements so suddenly. Mother was in perfect health." "Please accept my deepest condolences, my dear," said Miss Marple, settling into the offered armchair. "Your mother was a splendid woman. Her seed cake was unparalleled in the county." A ghost of a smile touched Helen's lips. She would have appreciated that commendation. Cooking was a pride, especially her baking and her cordials. "I understand she was known to bring her elderflower concoction to the knitting circle." "Yes, she was rather famous for it. Made it to my grandmother's recipe. It won prizes at the village fete 3 years running." "Did she prepare a fresh batch for yesterday's meeting?" Helen looked momentarily puzzled by the question. "I presume so. She was very particular about freshness." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's expression remained benignly interested. "Oh, mere curiosity." "Did your mother speak much about the other members of the circle? Lady Hartley Groves, for instance?" Helen's features tightened almost imperceptibly. She found Lady Hartley Groves rather overbearing, though she was too polite to say so directly. More grandeur than substance was her private assessment. "And Mr. Malcolm, the new member, did she mention him?" At this, a definite shadow crossed Helen Simmons' countenance. "She did. Quite recently, in fact. She seemed troubled by his presence in the village." "In what way troubled?" Helen hesitated, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Mother was not given to flights of fancy. Miss Marple, she was a practical, level-headed woman. But last Sunday, after church, she said something rather strange. She said she believed she had encountered Mr. Malcolm many years ago under a different name. Did she elaborate? Not willingly. When I pressed her, she said it was during her time in London, before she married my father. She worked as a clerk in a bank that her father managed. There was an embezzlement scandal, quite a significant sum was stolen, and a junior employee was implicated. He protested his innocence vehemently, but the evidence was compelling. He was sentenced to transportation. And your mother believed this man was Mr. Malcolm? She wasn't certain. She said it had been over 40 years and people change. But there was something about his hands, she said, long, tapering fingers with unusually shaped nails, and a habit of tapping his right index finger when he was thinking. A distinctive gesture that she remembered vividly. Did she confront him with her suspicions? No. She intended to make inquiries first. She wrote to her cousin Mildred, who still lives in London, asking her to visit the public record office and examine the court transcripts from the case. The letter only went out on Tuesday. There couldn't possibly have been a reply yet. Miss Marple absorbed this information with a thoughtful nod. When your mother's possessions were returned to you from the parish hall, was there anything unusual among them, anything that didn't belong to her? Helen considered the question. Not that I noticed. Her knitting bag contained her usual implements, needles, wool, scissors, her pattern book, a tape measure. Oh, and a small package that I haven't yet opened. Miss Marple's interest sharpened perceptibly. A package, yes, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. I assumed it was wool that she had purchased from Mrs. Ellis at the haberdashery. She mentioned wanting a particular shade of yellow for the baby's bonnet. Might I see this package, if it's not too much trouble? Looking somewhat bewildered by the request, Helen rose and left the room, returning moments later with a small parcel approximately 6 inches square. It was indeed wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine, with no external markings to indicate its contents or origin. "How very curious," murmured Miss Marple, examining it carefully without untying the string. "And you say it was in your mother's knitting bag when it was returned to you?" "Yes, nestled at the bottom, beneath her wool." "Is it significant in some way?" Miss Marple handed the package back with a reassuring smile. "Probably not, but I should advise caution in opening it, perhaps in the presence of the constable." Helen's eyes widened. "You can't possibly think, Miss Marple. Are you suggesting that my mother's death wasn't natural? That someone—" She seemed unable to complete the terrible thought. "I'm suggesting nothing of the sort, my dear," Miss Marple soothed. "Merely exercising an old woman's excessive caution. Now, I must be on my way. I've taken up quite enough of your time during this difficult period." As Miss Marple made her way back through the village, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a motor car approaching from behind at a somewhat alarming velocity. She stepped prudently to the side of the lane, just as the vehicle, a gleaming Bentley of recent manufacture, slowed beside her. "Miss Marple, is it not?" inquired the driver, a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, distinguished in appearance with silver at his temples and a neatly trimmed mustache. "Reginald Malcolm. I believe we have not been formally introduced, though your reputation precedes you." Miss Marple inclined her head with just the right degree of polite acknowledgment. "How do you do, Mr. Malcolm? Indeed, I have heard your name mentioned in connection with the knitting circle. I wonder if I might prevail upon you to join me for luncheon at the Blue Boar? I find myself in need of congenial company, and I've been given to understand that your conversation is most enlightening." There was something in his manner smoothness, a practiced charm that put Miss Marple immediately on her guard. Yet here was an opportunity that could not be overlooked. "How very kind. I should be delighted. Mr. Malcolm," as she settled into the passenger seat of the luxurious automobile. Miss Marple was acutely aware that she was now in the company of the man who might well have administered poison to Augustus Simmons less than 24 hours previously. The fact did not disturb her equanimity in the slightest. After all, one encountered evil in the most genteel of settings. She had long ago learned that lesson. The drive to the village inn was brief, but informative. Mr. Malcolm proved to be an accomplished conversationalist, touching upon topics from the weather to the architectural merits of St. Mary Mead's Norman church, with the ease of one accustomed to social discourse at the highest levels. "You must find our village quite a change from your previous surroundings," ventured Miss Marple, as they were seated at a secluded table in the inn's dining room. "A refreshing one," replied Malcolm with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "After years of wandering, I find myself drawn to the stability of English country life, the rhythms of the seasons, the reassuring predictability of rural customs, and the knitting circle provides a social outlet, I imagine, among other things," he agreed, signaling to the waiter. "I find the activity itself meditative. The repetitive motion of the needles has a calming effect on the mind, rather like worry beads in the East, or the rosary in Catholic tradition, a spiritual practice. Then, of a sort though I lay no claim to conventional piety, the meal proceeded with an exchange of seemingly innocuous observations. Yet Miss Marple sensed an underlying current to the conversation. as though they were engaged in a complex dance, each probing for weakness, each revealing only what they chose. "I understand there was an unfortunate occurrence at yesterday's meeting," she remarked, as they were served apple tart and custard. A shadow passed briefly across Malcolm's features. "Most distressing. Poor Mrs. Simmons, a heart condition. I gather so the doctor believes. Were you previously acquainted with Mrs. Simmons, Mr. Malcolm?" His spoon paused momentarily on its journey to his mouth. "Only through the circle. A charming woman, her reminiscences of old London were quite captivating. She spent her youth there, I believe, as I understand." "Did you indeed? Though in vastly different circles, I imagine." Mrs. Simmons spoke of Cheapside and the city. "My own experiences were centred around Mayfair and St. James's. The life of Miss Marple was now convinced. It was delivered with consummate ease. Reginald Malcolm was a man accustomed to reinventing his past as circumstances required. A dangerous man, potentially. Yet there remained the question of motive. Why should he eliminate Augusta Simmons after so many years? What threat could she possibly pose to him now? As though reading her thoughts, Malcolm leaned forward, slightly. "I sense you have questions about me, Miss Marple. Natural curiosity regarding a newcomer to your close-knit community. Let me save you the trouble of delicate inquiry. I am a widower of independent means. My late wife's family had interests in South American mining, which provided me with a modest competence. I have travelled extensively, have no children, and came to St Mary Mead seeking peace after a rather tumultuous life. Does that satisfy your curiosity?" "Admirably put, Mr. Malcolm," replied Miss Marple with a gentle smile, "though I confess my interest extends beyond mere biographical details. I find human nature endlessly fascinating, the patterns of behaviour that repeat themselves across all strata of society." "Patterns," he echoed, an indefinable weariness entering his expression. "Yes, just as in knitting. One sees the same motifs recurring. The basic stitches knit and purl combine in countless variations, yet the fundamentals remain constant. So too with human conduct the same essential drives ambition, fear, love. Revenge manifest in diverse ways, but are recognizable to the observant eye. And yours is certainly an observant eye, if local reputation is accurate." Malcolm's tone was light, but Miss Marple detected a new tension in his bearing. "They say little escapes your notice in St. Mary Mead." "Oh, people exaggerate so," she demurred. "I am merely an elderly spinster with perhaps too much time for contemplation." "I suspect you are a great deal more than that, Miss Marple." He signalled for the bill. "But I have monopolized your afternoon long enough. Allow me to drive you home." As they departed the inn, Miss Marple was conscious of several pairs of eyes following their progress. Mrs. Henson from the post office, Colonel Bantry on his way to the gunsmith's, and most notably, Lady Hartley Groves, who had just emerged from the milliner's across the street. The elderly aristocrat's expression, as she observed Miss Marple being handed into Malcolm's motor car, could only be described as thunderous. Another thread in the complex tapestry of village relationships. Noted Miss Marple, and potentially another motive. The game was becoming more intriguing by the hour. Chapter 3. The Dropped Stitch. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Miss Marple's garden as she tended to her roses, a task that provided not only aesthetic satisfaction but an opportunity for uninterrupted contemplation. The physical act of pruning required just enough attention to keep her hands occupied, while leaving her mind free to examine the facts she had gathered thus far. Augusta Simmons had recognized Reginald Malcolm from her youth, a man convicted of embezzlement and supposedly transported, yet here he was, 40 years later, wealthy and refined. inserting himself into the very community where a potential witness to his former identity resided. It suggested either remarkable audacity or a specific purpose. But what purpose could that be? Mrs. Simmons had been merely a clerk at the time of the embezzlement. Would her recognition truly threaten a man who had so clearly reinvented himself? Unless, of course, she had known something beyond the official record. Miss Marple's reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose heavy tread upon the garden path announced his presence before he came. Interview. The inspector had never been known for his subtlety either in movement or in investigative technique. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." He greeted her with the forced patience of one who has learned through bitter experience that this elderly lady, however irritating, could not be entirely dismissed. "I understand you've been making inquiries about Mrs. Simmons' death." Miss Marple straightened, wincing slightly as her back protested the movement. "Good afternoon, Inspector." "Yes, at the request of Mrs. Weatherby, who is most distressed by the circumstance." "Mrs. Weatherby," Slack repeated with evident disdain. "A woman with an overactive imagination and too many detective novels on her bookshelf. She's been bending my ear about poison and mysterious vials until I'm half convinced. She planted the ideas in her own mind." "Perhaps," conceded Miss Marple mildly, "though I wonder if you've had the opportunity to speak with Miss Helen Simmons regarding a certain package found in her mother's knitting bag." The inspector's expression sharpened. "Package? What package?" "A small parcel wrapped in brown paper. I suggested she might open it in your presence as a precaution." "This is the first I'm hearing of it," Slack declared, his irritation visibly mounting. "Why wasn't I informed immediately?" "I rather thought she would contact you directly," Miss Marple replied placidly. "Perhaps she felt it unnecessary, given Dr. Haddock's conclusion regarding natural causes." Inspector Slack checked his watch with an impatient gesture. "Call on her straight away. In the meantime, Miss Marple, I would appreciate it if you would refrain from spreading unfounded rumors about murder in my jurisdiction. We have quite enough excitement with the church fete approaching without adding imaginary poisoners to the mix." With that, he departed as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Miss Marple to return to her roses and her ruminations with a small smile. Playing about her lips. Inspector Slack's involvement would accelerate matters considerably. For all his bluster, he was a thorough policeman when properly motivated. The following morning brought a visit from Dolly Bantry, who arrived in a state of hardly suppressed excitement, her hat askew and her cheeks flushed with the exertion of her brisk walk from Gossington Hall. "Jane, you'll never guess what's happened," she exclaimed, barely waiting for Florence to show her into the sitting room. "Helen Simmons has been taken to the hospital in a state of collapse." Miss Marple set aside her knitting with a concerned frown. "Dear me, when did this occur?" "Late last night. Inspector Slack went to see her about some package you'd mentioned and found her unconscious on the drawing-room floor. The parcel was open beside her, and according to my cook, who had it from the constable's wife, there was a dead mouse inside." "A mouse?" echoed Miss Marple, her eyebrows rising. "How very peculiar, isn't it? And that's not all. The doctor says she's exhibiting symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. She's not expected to survive the day." Miss Marple's expression grew grave. "This is most distressing news, Dolly. Poor Helen." "Has Inspector Slack made any arrests?" "Not yet, though I understand he's been questioning that new man Malcolm. Arthur saw him being escorted to the police station this morning as he was on his way to the fishmonger's." "Indeed? On what grounds, I wonder?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, it seems that Helen regained consciousness briefly in the ambulance. and managed to gasp out something about Malcolm and revenge. Then she lapsed back into unconsciousness and hasn't spoken since. How very convenient for someone, murmured Miss Marple. Whatever do you mean, Jane? Consider, Dolly. Helen Simmons was the one person who knew of her mother's suspicions regarding Mr. Malcolm's true identity. With both mother and daughter silenced, there would be no one to connect him to his past indiscretions. But, Jane, surely the mouse in the package points directly to him. It's as good as a signed confession. Is it? Miss Marple's tone was thoughtful. It seems rather too obvious, doesn't it? Almost as if someone wished us to draw precisely that conclusion. Mrs. Bantry frowned, clearly struggling to follow her friend's reasoning. You're suggesting he's being framed. But who would do such a thing? That, Dolly, is the question we must answer. Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more, her needles moving with increased purpose. I believe it's time I joined the Thursday knitting circle. Would you be so kind as to accompany me? I understand it's to continue despite recent events. Well, of course I'll come with you, Jane, but I'm not much of a knitter, as you know. Your presence rather than your prowess is what I require, Miss Marple assured her with a smile. Extra eyes and ears are always valuable, and perhaps you might engage Lady Hartley Groves in conversation. I sense she may have insights she has not yet shared. Thursday arrived with an unseasonably warm clarity that seemed almost indecent, given the grim circumstances. Helen Simmons remained in hospital, hovering between life and death, while Reginald Malcolm had been released from questioning. Due to lack of concrete evidence, much to Inspector Slack's evident frustration, the knitting circle had been moved from the parish hall to Lady Hartley Grove's residence, Hartley Hall, ostensibly due to a leaking roof. At the usual venue, Miss Marple suspected the change had more to do with Lady Hartley Grove's desire to assert control over the gathering. During this period of disruption, the hall was an imposing Jacobean structure that had seen better days. Faded grandeur was evident in the peeling gilt of the picture frames, and the worn patches on what had once been magnificent Turkish carpets. Lady Hartley Groves, herself a tall woman, with a patrician nose and steel-grey hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure, greeted them with the brittle charm of one accustomed to commanding rather than welcoming. Miss Marple, how unexpected! And Mrs. Bantry, too. I wasn't aware you had joined our little group. We thought we might offer our support during this difficult time, explained Miss Marple gently. Such a distressing business with poor Mrs. Simmons and now her daughter. Lady Hartley Grove's expression remained impassive, though her fingers tightened perceptibly on the lace handkerchief. She carried an affectation rather than a necessity, indeed, most unfortunate. Well, we are gathering in the morning room. Do follow me. The morning room, despite its name, was a rather gloomy chamber, overlooking an overgrown rose garden. Its windows, though large, were partly obscured by heavy velvet drapes that had faded from crimson to a dusty maroon. Already seated around a circular table were Mrs. Crawford, Miss Peterson, Mrs. Weatherby, and to Miss Marple's slight surprise, Reginald Malcolm. Mr. Malcolm, exclaimed Mrs. Bantry with less tact than might have been desired. I understood you were assisting the police with their inquiries. A tense silence followed this pronouncement, broken by Malcolm's soft chuckle. A brief consultation only. Mrs. Bantry. Inspector Slack was kind enough to acknowledge that I had no connection whatsoever to the unfortunate incident. Naturally, interjected Lady Hartley Groves with a significant glance at Mrs. Bantry. The very idea is absurd. Now, shall we proceed with our meeting? We are working on items for the church fete, as you know, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry. What projects have you brought? Miss Marple produced a half-finished baby blanket from her capacious handbag. I thought something simple, given that I'm a visitor. The next hour passed in seemingly innocuous activity, with a click of needles providing a rhythmic backdrop to conversations that flowed from the vicar's latest sermon to the shocking price of tea. Yet Miss Marple, observing with the focused attention of a naturalist studying rare specimens, noted several interesting dynamics. Lady Hartley Groves positioned herself closer to Mr. Malcolm than was strictly necessary, occasionally leaning toward him with a proprietary air. Miss Peterson, the mousy companion, watched this interaction with an expression that flickered between resentment and resignation. Mrs. Weatherby's hands trembled visibly whenever Malcolm addressed her directly, while Mrs. Crawford maintained a forced cheerfulness that did not quite disguise her unease. As for Malcolm himself, he exhibited the same polished charm that Miss Marple had observed during their luncheon, yet there was a new weariness in his bearing, a vigilance that suggested he felt himself under scrutiny from more than just the police. "I understand there's been no improvement in Miss Simmons' condition," remarked Lady Hartley Groves during a lull in the general conversation. "Most distressing. Dr. Haddock appears quite baffled by the nature of her ailment," observed Malcolm quietly. "Arsenic poisoning is notoriously difficult to treat. Once it has progressed beyond the initial stages, the damage to the internal organs is often irreversible." All eyes turned to him, and Mrs. Weatherby gave a small gasp. "You seem remarkably well informed on the subject, Mr. Malcolm," noted Miss Marple, her tone conversational. He met her gaze steadily. "My travels in South America brought me into contact with various toxic substances used by indigenous tribes. One develops a certain academic interest in such matters." "How fascinating," murmured Miss Marple. "And did your academic interest extend to the preparation of elderflower cordial by any chance?" The question, delivered with such gentle innocence, caused a perceptible shift in the atmosphere of the room. Lady Hartley Groves' handkerchief clattered to the floor. Mrs. Crawford dropped a stitch with a soft exclamation of dismay, and Malcolm's right index finger began to tap slowly against the arm of his chair, precisely the gesture that Helen Simmons had described as characteristic of the man her mother had recognized. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, Miss Marple," he replied after a moment's hesitation. "Oh, it was merely an idle thought," she responded, returning her attention to her knitting. "Mrs. Simmons was so renowned for her cordial, you see. I wondered if you had ever had the opportunity to observe her method of preparation." "I had." "Not that pleasure," said Malcolm stiffly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I find I must depart earlier than anticipated. A telephone call from London that cannot be postponed." As he rose to leave, Lady Hartley Groves reached out to detain him with a surprisingly familiar touch on his arm. "Must you go, Reginald? I had hoped you might stay for a light supper." "Another time, perhaps," he responded, disengaging himself with a smoothness that none the less conveyed definite rejection. "Ladies, good afternoon." After his departure, the gathering quickly dispersed, the earlier camaraderie strained though it had been dissolving into awkward farewells. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry lingered, ostensibly to assist Lady Hartley Groves with the tea things, though their hostess made it clear that her maid would attend to such matters. "You seem to have developed a rather sudden interest in knitting," observed Lady Hartley Groves, with poorly concealed suspicion. "Might one inquire as to the true purpose of your visit today?" "The same as yours, I imagine," replied Miss Marple placidly. "To maintain the comforting routines of village life in the face of distressing events, indeed." The aristocratic eyebrow arched skeptically. "And your insinuations regarding Mr. Malcolm, were they similarly motivated by a desire for comfort?" Not insinuations, Lady Hartley Groves merely questions. I find that in cases of unexpected death, questions often lead to illumination. Augusta Simmons died of heart failure as certified by a qualified medical practitioner, stated Lady Hartley Groves firmly. Any suggestion to the contrary is not only erroneous but potentially slanderous. And her daughter's condition? Is that to a result of natural causes, a flash of something, anger, fear? Crossed Lady Hartley Groves' features before her aristocratic composure reasserted itself. I couldn't possibly comment on medical matters beyond my expertise. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have correspondence requiring my attention. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry made their way back through the village, the lengthening shadows of late afternoon lending an ominous cast to the familiar landscape, Dolly could no longer contain her curiosity. "Well, Jane, what did you make of it all?" Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "I observed several interesting things, Dolly. Mr. Malcolm's reaction to my question about the cordial, for one, and Lady Hartley Groves' anxiety to protect him. But most revealing of all was Miss Peterson's behavior when she thought no one was watching. Miss Peterson, that mousy little creature, I scarcely noticed her. Precisely why she bears closer observation," replied Miss Marple with a small smile. "The overlooked often see and hear much, and sometimes they act upon what they know in ways that can surprise us all." As they approached the turn to Gossington Hall, a police automobile sped past them in the direction of Hartley Hall, its official urgency leaving no doubt that yet another development had occurred in the increasingly complex case. "Oh," exclaimed Mrs. Bantry, watching it disappear around the bend. "What do you suppose has happened now?" "I suspect," said Miss Marple gravely, "that someone else has made the unfortunate acquaintance of arsenic. The question is who?" The answer would have to wait, but Miss Marple felt certain that the tangled web of deceit surrounding the knitting circle was beginning to unravel one deadly strand at a time. Chapter 4. Unraveling threads. The following morning's post brought a telegram from Miss Marple, delivered by the red-faced village boy who served as auxiliary to the regular postman. During periods of high volume, the message from Colonel Melchett of the county police was tersely informative. "Lady Hartley Groves dead. Stop. Suspicious circumstances. Stop. Your presence requested. Hartley Hall. 3 p.m. Stop. Melchett." "Dear me," murmured Miss Marple, tucking the telegram into her pocket as she thanked the boy with a penny for his trouble. Another death, and this time the county police were involved rather than merely Inspector Slack. The situation had escalated beyond the boundaries of village jurisdiction. She spent the morning in purposeful preparation, reviewing her mental notes on the case thus far while her hands remained occupied with domestic tasks. Florence, accustomed to her mistress's occasional distraction when puzzling through a problem, asked no questions when instructed to press Miss Marple's second best, black silk, and to polish the silver locket that contained a memento of her mother's hair. At precisely 2 o'clock, Miss Marple set forth for Hartley Hall, her appearance suitably sombre for a visit connected with recent bereavement. The afternoon was cool but clear, the earlier autumnal tempests having given way to a more settled spell that, in Miss Marple's experience, often preceded the first true frosts of the season. The grounds of Hartley Hall presented a scene of unusual activity. 2 police automobiles stood in the gravelled forecourt, alongside Dr. Haddock's modest Austin and a more imposing Demler, that Miss Marple recognized as belonging to Colonel Melchett himself. A constable stationed at the entrance nodded respectfully as she approached, clearly having been instructed to admit her inside. The hall's faded grandeur seemed somehow diminished by the practical bustle of police activity. Colonel Melchett, a tall, distinguished figure with a military bearing and a neatly trimmed mustache, that had seen better days, was conferring with Inspector Slack in the entrance hall. He broke off their conversation at the sight of Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank you for coming so promptly. Most distressing business indeed. Colonel Lady Hartley Groves was a significant presence in our community." "Harumph," said Slack. "Well, significant presences can still meet with foul play, it seems. The Colonel shot him a look, yes. Well, Slack here was just filling me in on the broader context of recent events in St Mary Mead." Inspector Slack's expression suggested that filling in might be a charitable description of their exchange. His natural disinclination to share information with Miss Marple appeared to have extended to his superior officer as well. Perhaps Miss Marple might care to see the scene, suggested the inspector with poorly concealed reluctance, given her previous involvement. Colonel Melchett nodded decisively. "Excellent suggestion. This way, if you please, Miss Marple." They proceeded upstairs to what had evidently been Lady Hartley Grove's bedchamber, a spacious but somewhat austere room dominated by a mahogany four-poster bed draped in faded damask. The lady herself had been removed, but the disarrangement of the bedclothes told its own tale of final distress. "Found by her maid this morning," explained the Colonel, keeping his voice low as though the deceased might still be disturbed by their conversation. "Apparently cried out in the night, but was dead before assistance could arrive. Initial examination suggests poison, same as the others." "The others?" queried Miss Marple. "You refer to Mrs. Simmons and her daughter?" "Precisely, though Helen Simmons appears to be rallying surprisingly. Haddock says she may pull through, though it's touch and go. Strong constitution, apparently." "That is encouraging news. Colonel, might I inquire if anything unusual was found in Lady Hartley Groves' possession? A package, perhaps, or some form of refreshment?" Colonel Melchett exchanged a glance with Inspector Slack. "As a matter of fact, yes. A box of chocolates on her bedside table, very fine ones from Fortnum's in London. Half-eaten, with the centres removed from several. Bit odd. Not if one considers that centres often contain liquor or cream, both excellent mediums for disguising the taste of certain poisons," observed Miss Marple. "Might I see these chocolates?" "They've been taken for analysis," interjected Inspector Slack hastily. "Standard procedure, of course." "And was there any indication of who might have sent this thoughtful but ultimately fatal gift?" "No card," replied Colonel Melchett, though Lady Hartley Groves made mention that Mr. Malcolm had called yesterday evening, bearing what appeared to be a gift. "How interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And Mr. Malcolm's current whereabouts?" "Unknown," admitted Inspector Slack with evident frustration. "He's not at his cottage, and his motor car is missing from the garage. We've circulated his description to ports and railway stations, but thus far, I see." Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful as she surveyed the room. "And has anyone spoken with Miss Peterson? I understand she was Lady Hartley Grove's particular friend." The slight emphasis she placed on particular was not lost on Colonel Melchett, whose eyebrows rose perceptibly. "Friend? Well, we haven't located her either. The housekeeper said she left abruptly last night, claiming a family emergency in Eastbourne. Both Mr. Malcolm and Miss Peterson absent," mused Miss Marple. "How very coincidental. May I ask if Lady Hartley Grove's desk has been examined?" "She was a woman who maintained an extensive correspondence." "Not yet," admitted the Colonel. "We've been focusing on the more immediate aspects of the investigation." "Might I?" suggested Miss Marple, indicating a delicate escritoire position near the window. With a nod from Colonel Melchett, she approached the desk and carefully opened its central drawer. Inside were the usual accoutrements of letter-writing, crisp sheets of monogrammed paper, several fountain pens, a silver letter opener, and a stack of correspondence neatly bound with blue ribbon. It was to this last item that Miss Marple directed her attention. "With your permission, Colonel?" she asked, her fingers hovering over the bundle. "By all means," he responded, curiosity evident in his tone, though he was not sure what she expected to find. Miss Marple untied the ribbon with careful precision and began to examine the letters. Most were of a commonplace nature: invitations, responses to same, communications regarding parish matters, but one, dated just a week previously, caused her eyebrows to rise fractionally. "Most illuminating," she murmured, scanning its contents. "What have you found?" demanded Inspector Slack, his professional reluctance to involve Miss Marple temporarily superseded by investigative curiosity. "A letter from Lady Hartley Grove's solicitor in London," replied Miss Marple, handing the document to Colonel Melchett. Regarding the terms of her late husband's will, the Colonel read quickly, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Good Lord! It appears the whole and most of the estate were not left to Lady Hartley Groves outright, but in a life interest only. Upon her death, everything passes to her husband's nephew Richard Hartley Groves, currently residing in Kenya. A significant detail," observed Miss Marple, "particularly when one considers that Lady Hartley Groves had recently withdrawn her own will, according to village gossip, leaving her personal fortune to whom?" inquired the Colonel sharply. "That I couldn't say with certainty," Miss Marple admitted, though she and Mr. Malcolm had become rather companionable of late. Inspector Slack's face darkened with suspicion. "So our missing Mr. Malcolm might have had a financial motive, after all. But that doesn't explain the deaths of Mrs. Simmons and the attempt on her daughter's life," suggested Miss Marple delicately. "Unless those incidents were merely diversionary, creating a pattern that pointed elsewhere to some older grudge or connection." Colonel Melchett considered this with the gravity it deserved. "You're suggesting an elaborate scheme to eliminate Lady Hartley Groves for her money disguised as part of a series of revenge killings linked to this embezzlement business from Malcolm's past?" "It would be an elegant solution," agreed Miss Marple, "though perhaps not the correct one. There remains the matter of Miss Peterson's hasty departure." "What of it?" asked Inspector Slack impatiently. "Family emergency," she said. "Miss Peterson has no family," replied Miss Marple quietly. "She mentioned as much during the knitting circle meeting, an orphan raised by the state, employed as a companion since the age of 18. This revelation caused both policemen to regard her with increased attention. Are you suggesting that Miss Peterson might be involved in these deaths?" asked Colonel Melchett. "I am suggesting that in matters of this nature one must consider all possibilities," replied Miss Marple cautiously, "including those that might seem improbable at first glance." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a constable, who entered with the nervous air of one bearing potentially unwelcome news. "Begging your pardon, sir, but we've just had word Mr. Malcolm's motor car has been found abandoned at Southampton docks. Harbour police report that the morning ferry to France departed 2 hours ago." "Damnation!" exclaimed Colonel Melchett. "He slipped through our fingers, perhaps," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Though it seems rather obvious, doesn't it? Leaving one's motor car in such a conspicuous location when attempting to flee the country." "What are you suggesting?" demanded Inspector Slack. "He abandoned the vehicle deliberately to mislead us. It would not be without precedent in cases of this nature. Things are seldom as straightforward as they initially appear." The Colonel sighed, his mustache drooping dejectedly. "Well, we'll circulate his description to the French police for all the good it will do, like looking for a needle in A continental haystack. I wonder, mused Miss Marple, if our attention might be more productively directed closer to home, specifically to Lord Danby's residence, the manor house. Inspector Slack frowned in confusion. What's that got to do with anything? Miss Peterson was companion to Lord Danby before her departure, explained Miss Marple, and if I recall correctly, Lord Danby possesses an extensive collection of antiquities gathered during his diplomatic service in the East, including perhaps items of a more esoteric nature. Colonel Melchet's eyes narrowed as he caught her implication. You think she might have had access to poison through Lord Danby's collection? But why? What possible motive could this Peterson woman have for murdering members of a knitting circle of all things? Miss Marple's expression was grave. That, Colonel, is what we must discover, and quickly. For I fear there may yet be another victim if we do not intervene in time. Another victim? Who? Helen Simmons, replied Miss Marple simply. She alone remains as a witness to whatever transpired in that knitting circle. If she regains consciousness fully, she may recall details that would incriminate the true perpetrator. By Jove, you're right, exclaimed the Colonel. Slack, arrange for a guard on Miss Simmons' hospital room immediately, and send someone to the manor house to inquire after this Peterson woman. As the flurry of activity following these instructions subsided, Miss Marple found herself momentarily alone in Lady Hartley-Grove's bedchamber. The oppressive silence seemed to hold echoes of the lady's final moments alone, in pain, betrayed by someone she had trusted. A small, leather-bound volume on the bedside table caught Miss Marple's attention. She opened it carefully to discover a diary, its entries meticulous and detailed, recording the minutiae of Lady Hartley-Grove's daily life. The final entry, dated the previous evening, contained a single cryptic line, or deceived me as. Has the pattern becomes clear at last? She murmured. It could only be Reginald Malcolm. But who was and what pattern had the unfortunate lady discerned too late to save herself? Miss Marple closed the diary thoughtfully, replacing it exactly as she had found it. The web of deceit surrounding these deaths was growing more complex by the hour. Yet somewhere within this tangle of false leads and misdirection lay a thread of truth that, once pulled, would unravel the entire design. And Jane Marple, with the patience born of countless hours bent over intricate knitting patterns, was determined to find it. Miss Marple, Colonel Melchet had returned, his expression somber. We've just had word from the hospital. Helen Simmons is awake and asking to speak with you specifically. Says she remembers something vital about the day her mother died. Then we must not keep her waiting, replied Miss Marple, gathering her handbag with renewed purpose, for I suspect, Colonel, that time is very much of the essence. As they departed Hartley Hall, Miss Marple cast a final glance at the imposing facade, its weathered stones, bearing witness to centuries of human drama. Behind those walls, someone had breathed their last in fear and pain. Justice demanded that their Keller be brought to account, no matter how respectable their appearance, no matter how ingenious their scheme. The game was reaching its critical phase, and Miss Marple was determined that this time death would not have the final word. Chapter 5. Picking up stitches, Market Basing Hospital presented a stark contrast to the faded elegance of Hartley Hall. Its utilitarian corridors, illuminated by harsh electric lighting, echoed with the efficient footsteps of nurses and the occasional groan of a patient in distress. Miss Marple, accompanied by Colonel Melchet, was escorted to a small private room at the end of a quiet wing, where a uniformed constable stood guard outside the door. She's still quite weak, cautioned the ward sister, a formidable woman whose starched uniform crackled with authority. Dr. Haddock has permitted a brief interview only. on the understanding that you will withdraw immediately should her condition deteriorate." "Of course," murmured Miss Marple. "We should be most careful." Helen Simmons lay propped against white pillows, her complexion nearly as pale as the linen surrounding her. The vibrant young woman of their previous encounter had been replaced by a diminished figure, her features drawn with suffering, her eyes sunken into dark hollows. Yet those eyes brightened with recognition as Miss Marple approached the bedside. "You came?" she whispered, her voice a frail echo of its former strength. "Yes, my dear. I understand you wish to speak with me." Helen attempted to raise herself slightly, wincing with the effort. "I remembered something about the day Mother died, something important." Miss Marple leaned closer, mindful of the Colonel's attentive presence behind her. "Take your time, Helen. There's no hurry." "But there is," insisted the young woman with surprising vehemence. "He'll try again." "I know too much." "Who will try again?" interjected Colonel Melchett gently. Helen's gaze, troubled and fearful, shifted between them. "Not who you think." "Not Mr. Malcolm." "Was the package?" asked Miss Marple. "I remember now. Mother received it that morning, before she left for the knitting circle, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She seemed puzzled by it, said there was no accompanying note. And did she open this package?" "Yes. It contained a vial of liquid clear like water. She thought it might be a new essence for her cordial. She'd been experimenting with different flavorings. She added a few drops to her elderflower bottle before leaving for the meeting." Helen's voice faltered. Tears welled in her eyes. "I helped her kill herself. Don't you see? By not questioning, by not being more careful." "You mustn't blame yourself so," soothed Miss Marple. "You had no reason for suspicion. Did your mother mention where the package might have come from?" Helen's brow furrowed with the effort of recollection. She wondered if it might be from the apothecary in Eastbourne. She'd inquired about essence of almond the previous week. "Essence of almond," repeated Miss Marple thoughtfully, "which might explain the scent Mrs. Weatherby detected. But surely a reputable apothecary wouldn't send such a substance without proper labeling?" "Precisely what Mother said. That's why she only used a tiny amount to test it." "Colonel." Melchett cleared his throat. "Miss Simmons, you mentioned remembering who was responsible, someone other than Mr. Malcolm." Helen's expression grew more troubled. "I'm not certain, but at the circle that day, I remember Mother speaking privately with Miss Peterson during the tea break. They seemed to be having a disagreement. Miss Peterson appeared quite agitated afterwards." "Did you overhear any of their conversation?" "Only fragments. Something about recognition and consequences." Mother's tone was accusatory. Miss Marple exchanged a significant glance with Colonel Melchett. "Most interesting. And the package you received, the one containing the dead mouse, did that arrive by post?" "No. It was hand-delivered. I assumed it was something Mother had ordered that arrived after her death. I never imagined." Helen's voice broke, and she closed her eyes momentarily, overcome by emotion. "I think that's quite enough for now," intervened the ward sister, who had entered silently during their exchange. "The patient needs rest." Miss Marple patted Helen's hand gently. "You've been most helpful, my dear. Try not to worry. The constable will remain outside your door, and no harm shall come to you." As they departed the hospital, Colonel Melchett's expression was grave. "Miss Peterson appears to be emerging as our prime suspect. But what possible motive could she have? I believe the time has come to investigate Miss Peterson's background more thoroughly," replied Miss Marple. Her position as companion to Lord Danby provided her with both access to potential poisons and a degree of respectability that deflected suspicion. But who is she really, and what connection might she have to the Simmons family? dispatched men to the manor house, but initial reports suggest she hasn't returned there. Lord Danby is most distressed by her unexplained absence. I imagine he would be, murmured Miss Marple, an elderly gentleman accustomed to having his every need anticipated. Tell me, Colonel, has anyone examined Mrs. Simmons' correspondence specifically? Any letters she might have received from her London cousin regarding that old embezzlement case? Not to my knowledge. Her personal effects would have been returned to her daughter's cottage after the initial investigation concluded it was natural causes. Then perhaps that should be our next port of call, suggested Miss Marple, with your permission. Of course. The cottage, when they arrived, showed signs of hasty departure, a chair overturned in the hall, a teacup shattered on the kitchen floor, evidence perhaps of Helen's collapse after opening the poison package. But what drew Miss Marple's attention was the small secretary in the drawing room, its drawers partially open, papers protruding in disarray. Someone has searched this desk, she observed, examining the disorder with a critical eye. Recently and in some haste. Colonel Melchett frowned. The constable who responded to the initial call reported nothing amiss, which suggests this intrusion occurred after Helen was taken to hospital. Someone was looking for something specific, perhaps the very correspondence we seek. A methodical examination of the desk revealed that several letters had indeed been removed, its absence evident from the disrupted sequence of dates. Yet the searcher had overlooked one significant item, a small diary tucked beneath the false bottom in the central drawer. Augusta Simmons' journal, murmured Miss Marple, turning the pages carefully, and here an entry dated just 3 days before her death. Letter from Mildred confirms my suspicions. AP was indeed present at the trial, though under a different name. Must consider how best to proceed with this knowledge. AP, echoed Colonel Melchett. Amelia Peterson, it would appear so. And if she was connected to that long-ago embezzlement case not as a mere observer, but as a participant with a personal stake in the outcome, it provides a motive for silencing Mrs. Simmons, concluded the Colonel, but it still doesn't explain Lady Hartley Grove's murder. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. Unless Lady Hartley Groves had also made the connection, perhaps through something Mrs. Simmons said before her death, the final diary entry, or deceived me as has their contemplation, was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, his countenance bearing the particular blend of irritation and reluctant respect that his interactions with Miss Marple typically evoked. We've located Miss Peterson, he announced without preamble. Or rather, she's presented herself at the police station in a state of considerable distress. Says she fears for her life and wishes to make a statement regarding recent events. Indeed. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose fractionally. How very fortuitous. And Mr. Malcolm's still missing, admitted Slack, though there's been a development there as well. The French police report no matching passenger disembarking from the ferry, and we've just received confirmation that his passport remains in his cottage. It seems his flight may have been staged as you suggested. Most interesting, murmured Miss Marple. I believe, Colonel, that matters are approaching their resolution. Shall we hear what Miss Peterson has to say? Chapter 6. The tangled, wet, small interview room at the police station was austere to the point of bleakness, its furnishings limited to a plain wooden table, and for uncomfortable chairs. Miss Peterson sat rigidly in one of these, her hands clasped tightly before her on the scarred table surface. She appeared markedly different from the mousy, self-effacing woman of the knitting circle, her posture more erect, her gaze direct and challenging, despite the evident fear in her eyes. Colonel Melchett conducted the formal aspects of the interview, with Inspector Slack taking notes and Miss Marple observing quietly from a corner position. That afforded her an excellent view of Miss Peterson's face. "Now then, Miss Peterson," began the Colonel, his tone betraying nothing beyond professional interest. "You've indicated a desire to make a statement regarding recent events in St Mary Mead. Before you proceed, I must caution you that anything you say may be used as evidence." "I understand," replied Miss Peterson, her voice steadier than might have been expected given her circumstances. "I have nothing to hide, at least not any more, though I fear it may already be too late." "Too late for what?" "To prevent further deaths." Her gaze flickered briefly toward Miss Marple. "I believe you have already surmised much of the truth, have you not?" Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "I have formed certain theories." "Yes, but I should prefer to hear your account. Miss Peterson, or should I say, Miss Amelia Parker?" A flicker of surprise crossed the woman's features before resignation settled in its place. "So, you've discovered that much?" "Yes, I was Amelia Parker before I reinvented myself. A necessary precaution after the trial. The embezzlement trial in which Reginald Malcolm, or whatever his true name might be, was convicted," clarified Miss Marple. "His name was Richard Mercer, then," said Miss Peterson, her tone growing bitter. "A charming young man with expensive tastes and flexible morals. We were to be married. I believed in his innocence, absolutely, even testified on his behalf, though it did no good. The evidence was overwhelming. Evidence that was perhaps not entirely authentic," suggested Miss Marple gently. Miss Peterson's laugh held no humor. "You are perceptive, Miss Marple. No, the evidence was manufactured, but not to incriminate Richard. Rather, to shield the true culprit. And that culprit was Augustus Simmons' father, Henry Wilson, the bank manager, who systematically embezzled funds over a period of years, then sacrificed an innocent employee to save himself. When discovery became inevitable, Colonel Melchett leaned forward, his interest visibly piqued. "You're alleging that Mrs. Simmons' father framed this man Mercer, and that was your motive for poisoning Mrs. Simmons all these years later?" "I did not poison Augusta," insisted Miss Peterson vehemently, "though I won't pretend I felt any warmth toward her. She knew what her father had done. She helped him falsify the ledgers. Her position as clerk gave her access to the accounts, you see. She was complicit in sending an innocent man to a penal colony." "Yet you made no attempt to expose this injustice at the time?" inquired Miss Marple. "What proof did I have? My word against that of a respected bank manager and his daughter. I was merely the fiancée of the accused, hysterical with grief," they said. Not to be taken seriously. The bitterness in her tone had intensified. "So I waited, changed my name, built a new life, and eventually, through diligent inquiry, discovered that Richard had survived his transportation, had even prospered in Australia, before returning to England under the name Malcolm. And you sought him out?" "Not immediately. I observed from a distance, first ensuring it was truly him. He had changed considerably, hardened by his experiences, of course more sophisticated, wealthier. Her expression softened momentarily, but still possessing those distinctive hands I remembered so well, and that habit of tapping his finger when deep in thought, the same characteristics that Mrs. Simmons recognized," noted Miss Marple. "Yes, when I learned she had moved to St Mary Mead, I engineered a position nearby companion to. Lord Danby at the Manor House then arranged to join the knitting circle, knowing she was a member. I needed to determine how much she recalled, whether she might recognize Richard as I had. And did she eventually, though she was uncertain at first? I watched her watching him, saw the moment of recognition dawn. After that, it was only a matter of time before she would expose him, expose us both. For I had my own reasons to maintain my new identity, Colonel Melchet's impatience became evident. "This is all very interesting as historical context, Miss Peterson, but it doesn't explain the deaths. If you didn't poison Mrs. Simmons, who did?" Miss Peterson's gaze dropped to her clasped hands. "Richard, I presume to protect himself from exposure, though he denied it when I confronted him." She looked up again, meeting Miss Marple's thoughtful gaze. "That's why I came forward today, because I believe there's been a terrible misunderstanding, a cascade of consequences stemming from false assumptions." "Please elaborate," encouraged Miss Marple. "After Augusta died, I believed Richard responsible. I confronted him, privately accused him of resorting to murder to protect his new identity. He denied it vehemently, claimed he'd been on the verge of revealing himself willingly, of challenging Augusta to acknowledge her father's crime, said he'd acquired evidence over the years, documents that could clear his name." "Did you believe him?" "I wasn't certain. Then Helen Simmons was poisoned, and I began to fear Richard might be eliminating anyone who could connect him to his past, including potentially myself. So I fled, temporarily," concluded Colonel Melchet. "I needed time to think, to consider the implications. Then I heard about Lady Hartley Groves. How does she connect to this tangled history?" asked Miss Marple. Miss Peterson hesitated. "She doesn't, at least not directly, but she had grown quite close to Richard. I feared she might have confided in her, shared his suspicions about me, suspicions that I was the poisoner, that I had eliminated Augusta out of delayed revenge, then attempted to frame him for the crime." Her voice faltered. "The terrible irony is that we each suspected the other, while the true killer may be someone else entirely." "And who might that be, in your estimation?" inquired Miss Marple. Before Miss Peterson could respond, a commotion in the corridor outside interrupted the interview. The door burst open to reveal a constable, his youthful face flushed with excitement. "Begging your pardon, sir," he addressed Colonel Melchet, "but we found Mr. Malcolm, or rather, what's left of him." "What do you mean, man? Speak plainly." "His body, sir, in the old well behind Rose Cottage. Initial examination suggests he's been dead for at least 48 hours, and there's clear evidence of poisoning." Miss Peterson's face drained of color. "Oh God," she whispered. "Then it's as I feared. We've all been blind to the true pattern." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes keen with interest. "And what pattern is that, Miss Peterson?" "Don't you see? It was never about Richard or me. We were merely convenient suspects with our dubious pasts and obvious motives. The true target all along was..." Her revelation was cut short by a sharp report from outside. Unmistakably a gunshot, followed by shouts of alarm and the pounding of feet. "Stay here," ordered Colonel Melchet, rising hastily. "Slack with me." As the policeman rushed from the room, Miss Marple moved closer to Miss Peterson, who sat frozen in apparent shock. "You were about to name the true target," prompted Miss Marple gently, "and perhaps, by extension, the true killer." Miss Peterson raised her eyes, now bright with fear. "It's Helen Simmons who was meant to die, has always been meant to die. The others were merely stepping stones to that end." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple, her expression grave. "For some secrets are worth killing to protect even after 40 years. Chapter 7, the final road. Commotion in the corridor resolved itself less dramatically than feared. The gunshot had come from outside the station, a farmer's shotgun accidentally discharged while being surrendered for a license renewal. No one was injured, though Inspector Slack's dignity suffered somewhat from his precipitous response to what proved a false alarm. Colonel Melchet returned to the interview room with renewed purpose, his military bearing more pronounced in moments of heightened tension. "Now then, Miss Peterson," he resumed, settling back into his chair. "You were about to explain your theory regarding these deaths, something about Helen Simmons being the true target." Miss Peterson cast a nervous glance toward Miss Marple as though seeking reassurance. Before proceeding, "It came to me only recently as I reviewed the sequence of events. Augusta's death might have been motivated by old grudges, as we assumed. But why target Helen? She was a child when the embezzlement occurred, entirely innocent of her grandfather's crimes. Unless," suggested Miss Marple quietly, "she possessed something that threatened the killer, something inherited from her mother, perhaps?" "Precisely," agreed Miss Peterson, "and I believe that something may have been documented. Proof of her grandfather's guilt, evidence that would exonerate Richard Mercer after all these years. But if Malcolm or Mercer had obtained such evidence, as you claimed he told you, why would he murder Augusta Simmons?" objected Colonel Melchett. "He could simply have presented his proof and cleared his name." "That's what troubled me," admitted Miss Peterson. "It made no sense. And now that we know Richard himself was murdered," she trailed off, the implications hanging heavily in the air. Miss Marple's needles had appeared from her handbag, and she worked steadily as she considered the matter, the gentle clicking, providing a rhythmic counterpoint to the tense atmosphere. "I believe," she said finally, "that we have been looking at this pattern from the wrong direction. Let us consider the facts as we know them. Augusta Simmons recognized Reginald Malcolm as the man her father had framed. She contacted her cousin in London to confirm her suspicions. Shortly thereafter, she was poisoned. Her daughter, Helen, then received a poisoned package, though she survived the attempt. Lady Hartley Groves was next to die, apparently after discovering some form of deception. And now we learn that Mr. Malcolm himself was murdered before any of these later events occurred. You're suggesting the same person killed them all?" asked Colonel Melchett. "I am suggesting that someone with connections to all the victims has been eliminating potential threats to a carefully constructed facade, someone who feared exposure on multiple fronts." Miss Peterson leaned forward intently. "But who had access to all these people? Opportunity to deliver poison and motive to eliminate them?" Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "I believe the answer lies with the one member of the knitting circle we have heard remarkably little about during this investigation. Mrs. Crawford, the vicar's wife." "Mrs. Crawford?" echoed Colonel Melchett incredulously. "But what possible motive could she have?" "A most compelling one," replied Miss Marple. "The protection of identity and inheritance. You see, I believe Mrs. Crawford is not who she claims to be." "Explain," demanded the Colonel, clearly struggling to follow this unexpected turn. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her expression grave. "When I visited Mrs. Crawford early in my inquiries, I noticed several inconsistencies in her behavior and statements. Her apparent ignorance of the scent of bitter almonds, despite her reputation as an accomplished baker. Her excessive praise of Mr. Malcolm, despite her usual tendency toward critical judgment. And most tellingly, her reaction when I mentioned elderflower cordial. What about it? She claimed that Augusta Simmons had offered her a sip during the meeting, which she declined. Yet according to Mrs. Weatherby's original account, Mrs. Simmons had barely touched her own cordial before collapsing. There would have been no opportunity for such an offer. A minor discrepancy, objected Inspector Slack, who would return to the room in time to hear this exchange. Perhaps, but coupled with other observations, it suggested a familiarity with events that could only come from direct involvement. I began to wonder about Mrs. Crawford's background, which led me to make certain inquiries through my nephew Raymond's connections in legal circles, and prompted Colonel Melchett, his interest visibly piqued, and I discovered that 20 years ago, A woman named Margaret Wilson, Augustus Simmons' younger sister, disappeared from her home in Eastbourne following allegations of serious financial impropriety involving charitable funds. The description of this Margaret bears a striking resemblance to our Mrs. Crawford. Allowing for the passage of time, Miss Peterson gasped softly. "Are you suggesting that the vicar's wife is actually Augusta's sister? But why would she kill her own sister?" "For the same reason people have committed murder since Cain slew Abel," replied Miss Marple sadly. "Envy, resentment, and fear of exposure. I believe Margaret Wilson, now Mrs. Crawford, embezzled those charitable funds just as her father had done before her. Perhaps dishonesty runs in families just as certain physical characteristics do. When her sister recognized Mr. Malcolm and began investigating the old case, Mrs. Crawford feared that her own past misdeeds might come to light during the ensuing scrutiny. But Lady Hartley Groves, Malcolm himself, how do they connect to this scenario? Mr. Malcolm was poisoned first, I suspect, when he approached Mrs. Crawford privately with his evidence against her father. Lady Hartley Groves likely discovered something incriminating while pursuing her interest in Mr. Malcolm, perhaps noted his absence when he was reported to be elsewhere, or intercepted a communication not meant for her eyes. Inspector Slack, ever practical, interrupted this theoretical exposition. "This is all very well, but it remains speculation without evidence. We can hardly arrest the vicar's wife on such a basis." "I believe the evidence exists," replied Miss Marple calmly. "In fact, I suspect it may be found in the vicarage kitchen among Mrs. Crawford's extensive collection of home-produced preserves and essences, including, perhaps, a certain essence of almond more potent than any available from a reputable apothecary." Colonel Melchett rose decisively. "Well, there's only one way to determine the truth of this theory. Slack, arrange for a search warrant for the vicarage immediately, and send a constable to check on Helen Simmons at the hospital. If Mrs. Crawford is indeed our poisoner, Miss Simmons may still be in danger." As the colonel and inspector departed to implement these measures, Miss Peterson turned to Miss Marple with a troubled expression. "If you're right about Mrs. Crawford, then I've been tragically mistaken about Richard all these years. I suspected him of Augusta's murder when in fact he was already a victim himself." "The truth often emerges in unexpected ways," consoled Miss Marple gently, "though rarely in time to undo all the harm that falsehood has caused." Their contemplation was interrupted by the return of Inspector Slack, his face ashen with dismay. "The constable stationed at Helen Simmons' hospital room reports that Mrs. Crawford visited less than an hour ago, bringing a basket of invalid comforts, approved by the vicar. The nurse allowed her a brief visit, thinking nothing amiss. When the constable checked on Miss Simmons afterward, he found her unconscious with a partially consumed bowl of homemade broth at her bedside." "Then we must hope we are not too late," said Miss Marple, rising with unexpected agility. "For if Helen Simmons dies, Mrs. Crawford will have eliminated the last person who might connect her to her past. The perfect murder, obscured by a fog of misdirection and historical grievance." As they hastened toward the door, Miss Peterson voiced the question that hung in the air. "And if she succeeds? If Helen dies before she can be questioned? Then," replied Miss Marple grimly, "we must rely on the evidence at the vicarage and the conscience of a woman who has already taken 3 lives in her determination to protect her false identity." The race against time had begun with a young woman's life hanging in the balance and a killer's carefully constructed web of deception, threatening to ensnare them all. Chapter 8. The final pattern revealed. Hospital corridor seemed interminable as Colonel Melchett, Inspector Slack, Miss Marple, and Miss Peterson hastened toward Helen Simmons' room. The ward sister intercepted them with a forbidding expression. That softened marginally upon recognizing the official nature of their party. Miss Simmons has been moved to urgent care, she informed them, her professional composure barely concealing her concern. Dr. Haddock is with her now, is she? The colonel left the grim question unfinished. She is fighting, replied the sister. Fortunately, she consumed only a small portion of the broth before becoming suspicious, and the constable raised the alarm quickly. Dr. Haddock administered. Lavage immediately. May we speak with the doctor? Inquired Miss Marple. When he's finished his treatment. In the meantime, the partially consumed broth has been secured as evidence as you requested. Inspector, and Mrs. Crawford has. She left the premises? The vicar's wife? Yes, some 15 minutes ago. She seemed in quite a hurry after her visit mentioned parish duties requiring her attention. Colonel Melchet's expression hardened. Slack, arrange for constables to secure the vicarage. Immediately, the lady must not be permitted to dispose of evidence or herself. As the inspector departed to implement these orders, Miss Marple approached the ward sister with a gentle authority, born of her years. Might we wait nearby? I believe Helen Simmons may have vital information to impart when she regains consciousness. The sister hesitated only briefly before nodding. The small waiting room at the end of the corridor is empty. I'll inform Dr. Haddock of your presence. Their vigil was mercifully brief. Within half an hour, Dr. Haddock joined them, his expression weary but cautiously optimistic. She's young and surprisingly resilient. Considering her previous poisoning, he informed them, with proper care, I believe she'll recover, though whether her constitution can withstand another such assault is doubtful. Is she able to speak briefly? She's asked to see Miss Marple specifically. The doctor's gaze shifted to the elderly lady. I can permit a few minutes only, and you must not tax her strength. Miss Marple nodded understanding. I shall be most careful, Doctor. Helen Simmons appeared even more fragile than during their previous encounter, her complexion possessing an alarming translucency, through which the blue veins at her temples were clearly visible. Yet her eyes, when they opened at Miss Marple's approach, were lucid and determined. You were right, she whispered, her voice barely audible. About everything. Mrs. Crawford? Prompted Miss Marple gently. Helen gave a slight nod. She admitted it when she thought I was too weak to understand. Said Mother had recognized her despite all the years, the changed appearance. Said Mother had always been too clever for her own good. Did she mention Mr. Malcolm? Said he threatened her documents proving her father's guilt, her own past crimes. Said she had no choice. Helen's voice faltered momentarily. She seemed almost proud of how cleverly she'd arranged it all, using Mother's cordial, making everyone suspect Mr. Malcolm. And the package with the dead mouse, that was a doing as well. Yes, she knew I had suspicions, wanted to silence me. When that failed, she tried again today. So methodical, so cold. Miss Marple patted the young woman's hand consolingly. You mustn't exhaust yourself, my dear. Rest now, knowing that justice will be served. Mrs. Crawford will answer for her crimes. A ghost of a smile touched Helen's pale lips. Mother would be pleased to know the truth came out after all. As Miss Marple rejoined the others in the waiting room, she found Colonel Melchet engaged in conversation with a newly arrived constable, whose expression conveyed unwelcome news. She's gone, sir. The vicarage is empty, and the vicar reports that his wife mentioned visiting a sick parishioner in Lower Mead this afternoon. He expected her return by tea time, a ruse to gain time for escape, concluded the colonel grimly. Alert all stations within a 50-mile radius. She cannot have gone far without transportation. If I might make a suggestion, interjected Miss Marple. I believe Mrs. Crawford would seek sanctuary in a place connected to her true identity somewhere, significant from her past as Margaret Wilson. Do you have a specific location in mind, indeed? Helen Simmons mentioned to me during our first meeting that her mother's family owned a small cottage on the coast, near Eastbourne, a holiday retreat used primarily in summer months. Given the season, it would likely be vacant now, providing an ideal temporary haven for someone in Mrs. Crawford's position. The Colonel's expression brightened with renewed purpose. Excellent thinking, Miss Marple. Constable, contact the Eastbourne police immediately with this information. The next several hours passed in intense anticipation, with updates arriving piecemeal from various quarters. The search of the vicarage revealed a hidden cupboard in Mrs. Crawford's personal pantry, containing multiple vials of clear liquid, one of which was labeled essence of bitter almond in her distinctive handwriting. More damning still was a small journal concealed beneath the floorboards of her sewing room, in which she had meticulously documented her observations of Augusta, Simmons and Reginald Malcolm, concluding with the chilling notation, "It must be done. Too much at risk." As the evening descended, the hospital corridor grew quiet, the regular staff replaced by the night shift. Miss Peterson had been permitted to return to Lord Danby's residence under police supervision, while Colonel Melchett refused to depart until news arrived from EASTBOURNE. Miss Marple, despite gentle suggestions that she might wish to rest at home, remained steadfast in her commitment to seeing the matter through to its conclusion. It was approaching midnight when Inspector Slack returned. His expression grim. "They found her," he announced without preamble, "at the Wilson family cottage as Miss Marple suggested. But I'm afraid justice will need to be served in a higher court than ours." "She's taken her own life." "Poison?" inquired Miss Marple quietly. Slack nodded. "Her own specialty." The Eastbourne police found her seated at the kitchen table, a partially consumed cup of tea before her and a note addressed to her husband, the contents of which, "A full confession, sir. She admits to the murders of Reginald Malcolm, her sister Augusta, and Lady Hartley Groves, as well as the attempts on Helen Simmons' life. She explains her motives much as Miss Marple deduced fear of exposure, both of her father's crime and her own embezzlement in Eastbourne. And no mention of remorse, I imagine." "None, ma'am. Only a request that her husband not think too harshly of her, as she had always endeavoured to be a proper vicar's wife despite her impediments." "Impediments?" echoed the Colonel with evident disgust. "A murderer's conscience classified as a mere impediment. Human nature remains constant, Colonel," observed Miss Marple sadly. "The capacity for self-justification is perhaps our most enduring trait and our most dangerous." The case concluded with remarkably little public fanfare. Given the gravity of the crimes involved, the vicar, devastated by his wife's deception and subsequent suicide, requested a temporary leave from his parish duties. Helen Simmons recovered, slowly but steadily, finding unexpected support from Miss Peterson, whose shared connection to the tragic events fostered a bond between the two women. The knitting circle disbanded by mutual, unspoken agreement. The remaining members found other outlets for their handiwork, though none that recaptured the convivial atmosphere that had existed before. Hidden venoms, both literal and figurative, had poisoned their gatherings. On a mild afternoon some weeks later, as the first tentative shoots of spring began to emerge from the winter-hardened earth, Miss Marple sat in her garden, working steadily on a pale blue baby blanket, the same one, in fact, that she had brought to the knitting circle on that fateful day. A gift she had decided for Helen Simmons, who had recently shared the news of her own impending motherhood, a new life to balance, in some small measure, those that had been so callously extinguished. Mrs. Bantry, calling for afternoon tea. Found her friend thus engaged in peaceful industry. "You've finished it at last, I see," she remarked, settling into the garden chair beside Miss Marple. "A lovely piece of work." "Thank you, Dolly. I found the pattern rather more complex than anticipated, but the final design has emerged satisfactorily, I believe. Rather like the knitting circle mystery itself," observed Mrs. Bantry with the proud air of one making a particularly apt comparison. "All those tangled threads finally resolved into a coherent pattern." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple, securing her final stitch with careful precision, "though the resulting design is hardly a pleasant one to contemplate." "No," conceded Mrs. Bantry soberly. "Multiple murders motivated by ancient grudges and desperate self-preservation hardly the bucolic tranquility one expects from village life." Miss Marple folded the completed blanket with methodical care. "And yet not so different from patterns we've observed before, Dolly. The human heart, with all its capacity for love and courage, remains equally capable of darkness and deception. One must simply learn to recognize the warning signs, the dropped stitches in the fabric of daily conduct that indicate a more fundamental flaw in the design." As Florence emerged from the cottage with the tea tray, the conversation turned to more mundane matters: the vicar's imminent return to his duties, the upcoming spring fete, the engagement of Colonel Bantry's niece to a promising young physician from Eastbourne. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered momentarily on the knitting circle case, with its complex interweaving of past and present, of ancient wrongs and modern retribution. The pattern had been intricate indeed, and the unravelling of it both satisfying and sorrowful, much like life itself, with its delicate balance of darkness and light, of endings and beginnings all stitched together into the vast ongoing tapestry of human experience.